Hi, my name is Pavas Mehra. I work with equity sales at Pareto Securities, and this is Pareto TV. Today we're going to interview Nicklas Westerholm, who is the CEO of PledPharma, a Swedish biotech company listed on the Stockholm main market. Welcome, Nicklas.
Thank you very much, Pavas.
Nicklas, we are going to discuss Pled today. Could you please just start off briefly by telling us a little bit about your background and also briefly about PledPharma?
Sure, and a pleasure being here, of course. My name is, as you mentioned, Nicklas Westerholm. I've been the CEO of PledPharma for close to 3 years now. Before that, I spent close to 17 years within global AstraZeneca drug development, as well as other business areas like investor relations, finance, and commercial manufacturing and supply. So PledPharma, in essence and in a nutshell, is a small biotech pharmaceutical company based in Sweden. We have 2 drugs in development today. Both of them are first-in-class drugs. Our lead asset up until now has been Pledox, which is developed for the reduction of or prevention of chemo-induced peripheral neuropathy associated with chemotherapy treatment. It's a huge unmet medical need in that setting. There are no drugs approved today on the market, and a substantial amount of patients receiving chemotherapy treatment are discontinuing their chemotherapy treatment due to these side effects. Our second asset is Aladote. We were on the planning for a pivotal study for market authorization in Europe and US. That's for the prevention of acute liver injury associated to paracetamol poisoning. It's slightly more niche type of drug, and we have orphan drug designation for that in the US.
And as you mentioned, Pled, you have had at least 2 ongoing phase 3 studies, Polar A and Polar M, for Pledox. And recently there have been quite a lot of news flow. In the end of January, we had a decision by FDA that chose to halt the Polar M study that was going on in the US. Could you please explain a little bit about the background to that?
Sure, and as you mentioned, we have had a turbulent first quarter of this year for Pledox. On the 23rd of January, the US FDA issued a clinical hold for the Polar program in the US. They had concerns around a few serious adverse events in the CNS space, and hence why they put us on clinical hold on that. We haven't commented on the exact nature on these clinical holds, and I won't go into that further. Having said that, though, we as a company, together with our independent drug safety monitoring board and other external experts, maintain the position that Pledox is not related to these CNS-related side effects, which is, of course, not aligned with FDA's view.
And looking a little bit closer on that, could you just briefly start by telling us about DSMB, the Drug and Safety Monitoring Board, their role, and what data they had access to and what data FDA had access to?
Sure. So Drug Safety Monitoring Board, or the DSMB, as you mentioned, is common to have as part of all clinical trials. They are, for us, independent experts in the field of neurology, oncology, and statistics. They are monitoring safety data, unblinded safety data, throughout the journey of the trial. So they have more or less access to all patient data in an unblinded fashion. When it comes to the FDA, in your question there, FDA had access to unblinded data for these 4 cases of CNS events only.
And why is that? Is that usually how it is done, or?
So all the regulatory authorities in the world, or where you carry out the study, will receive on a monthly basis so-called adverse events reports. Those are blinded, so this information is sent to the FDA, to the PMDA in Japan, MHRA in UK, etc. So all regulatory authorities have access to the same information. Obviously, FDA was the one that picked up these CNS-related events from their perspective and had a concern, and hence asked for more data.
And also looking at afterwards, we had a similar reaction from the French authority as well. Could you give us some background on their decision?
Sure, and I think it's very much aligned with the decision of the FDA. I think, again, it's important to recognize that this information around all events when it comes to serious adverse events and adverse events are provided to all regulatory authorities. We have had dialogues with other authorities as well, like the Japanese authority PMDA, the UK authority MHRA, and discussed this, etc., and they haven't had the same concern. FDA had the concern around this, and then subsequently the French regulatory authority ANSM followed through on that with the same view.
Okay. So basically, initially, it was only FDA pausing the study in the US, but you were planning on keeping the studies going in the rest of the world. And then after the French authorities came with their decision, you stopped them in Europe as well.
And correction there, we decided to halt or pause the randomization, i.e. the recruitment of new patients and dosing. And the reason for that is that the risk it then carries with extrapolation to other regulatory authorities, etc., etc. We took a company decision then to stop or pause dosing and recruitment of new patients.
And another question I would like to highlight is there was a section of the FDA that was evaluating the PledOx study that was basically not the oncology section. Why is that, and what section did actually make this decision?
So the decision PledOx are in is the division of anesthesia and analgesia. The decision where to place products in development, i.e. what decision, is the sole discretion of the FDA. Of course, the company, we as a sponsor, can have comments, but the decision made by the FDA was made by the decision of anesthesia and analgesia, not the oncology division.
And is that something that you can somehow try to get changed in the future, or is it paused for now?
I think that's, of course, something we can always request. Obviously, again, it's up to the decision of the FDA itself to where to place the drugs.
And moving on, in the beginning of April, you chose to halt the study trial ahead of schedule based on a recommendation from the DSMB, and that was based on some allergic reactions relating to the patients. Could you tell us a bit more about that decision?
Yes, of course, and you're referring to the announcement we made on the 6th of April, where we as a company decided to stop the POLAR program and have an early data cutoff and subsequent readout of data. This was in relationship to a recommendation by the DSMB, where they had concerns about accumulation of 8 cases of allergic reactions. This was a recommendation by the DSMB. I think it's worthwhile noting that the DSMB is not a decision-making body, it's a recommendation made by the DSMB. Having said that, though, in the context of schemes and the other things, aspects we have mentioned during the discussion today, we thought that was the best option to do for the company at this point in time.
And were these allergic reactions relating to the metastatic patients or the juvenile?
It's related to both, actually. I'm not privy to, just to be clear, I was referring to 8 patients that the DSMB is referring to in their recommendation. I'm not privy to unblinded data here. I know it's 8 patients. I know it's across the board in the Polar A study adjuvant setting and the Polar M study, the metastatic setting.
I understand. And has anything like this been observed previously in your studies?
So yes, to start off with, I think to say that the phase 2B trial, the so-called PLIANT trial, we had 1 case of allergic reactions or allergic hypersensitivity reaction.
I understand.
Having said that, though, I think it's important to recognize, and we have mentioned this before, that allergic reactions are not uncommon in the treatment of oxaliplatin. 1 to 2% of all patients treated with oxaliplatin are suffering from allergic hypersensitivity reactions and symptoms.
So it's really difficult to separate if it's the oxaliplatin treatment or the PledOx treatment that has caused this.
And I think that's the challenge we're facing, obviously, with DSMB being privy to unblinded data. One can assume, or at least it applies, that the recommendation is based on an imbalance between the treatment arm with PledOx and the placebo arm. Having said that, though, of course, for us the challenge going forward would be, and what we're going to focus on, would be to look at why does this occur in co-administration with oxaliplatin? Does PledOx have a role in that? And also, subsequently, why does it occur so far down the treatment line? So I think it's important also, and I forgot to mention that the allergic reaction seen haven't been said before treatment cycle 6.
Okay, so it's at a late stage this has
Correct.
occurred. I understand. So now that you have chosen to stop the trial ahead of schedule, how are you looking to proceed further?
So we looked at a number of different options, of course, based on the DSMB recommendation. The driver to stop the study, have an early readout, was of course the DSMB decision. However, going forward, we looked at a number of different options to try to solve for these allergic reactions, lift the clinical holds in France and the US, and carry on with the trial was of course an option. Having said that, though, if you look at the totality and from a holistic perspective, and from a shareholder perspective, of course, we believe that the best decision was to have an early close down of the study with the data cut off at some point during Q3 and a subsequent readout. Because the patients we have enrolled today in the Polar program is quite substantial. The amount of patients we have enrolled in the Polar program is quite substantial. So that the data we will be generating will be sufficient for a thorough safety and efficacy analysis of the drug and subsequently a benefit risk assessment of PledOx overall.
Okay, so basically the readout now will be based on 420 patients instead of 720, which was planned initially. But that is basically, that won't affect the robustness of the study.
So I think it's a couple of things there. So the initial ambition was 700 patients to randomize in total. We have randomized 590 patients so far. Right. The number 420 you were mentioning are the ones that have proceeded past treatment cycle 6, which is important, for we believe that is sufficient to, 1, develop neuropathy, 2, show potential treatment effect of our drug, which means that we have a robust sample size to do the safety and efficacy analysis of. Okay, all right.
And so when do you think that you will be able to release the top-line data?
So as I mentioned, the ambition is to have a data cutoff at some point during Q3. I can't promise a date to you today when we have the data, but we'll work on to have it as soon as possible after that. The challenge we have here is, of course, around data collection and cleaning of the database in the COVID-19 pandemic time. So I won't promise any date after that, but as soon as possible after that, of course.
And in simple terms, what do you need to show to meet your endpoints?
So I think in simple terms, what we need to show is of course a favorable benefit profile versus the safety profile. One can be fair to say that the risk or the safety profile have increased now if you think about the allergic reactions, not confirmed of course related to PledOx and the CNS related event. The perception leads that increased. So we're looking at it from a totality perspective, the benefit versus the safety, and of course the primary endpoint we had originally was to to prevent neuropathy by 50%. So active 50% less than the placebo group, and that's still the ambition to prove.
I understand. So that's going to be really interesting to follow moving on forward. Mentioning the next product in your portfolio, Aladote. What is next for Aladote? How is that process moving on forward? So
Aladote, of course, is as we mentioned before, we're moving ahead with full focus. Worthwhile noting, as I'm sure you're aware about, is that it's based on the same API. Having said that, though, it's a number of aspects that is important to factor into the continued development of Aladote. One, of course, I mentioned that these allergic reactions, for example, is not seen until treatment cycle 6. Aladote is giving us a single administration, of course, and it is in a totally different patient population with a different benefit-risk profile of those patients.
I understand. Probably all news flows will be affected by the current COVID situation, but are there any news flow that we can expect regarding to Aladote?
Yes, so the next steps are that we have a development program that we have aligned with authorities that consists of 1 pivotal trial going forward for market authorization application in both US and Europe. We are in the final stages to finalize the detailed design of the specific study through upcoming regulatory interactions. And then we plan to initiate the study subsequently. Again, here again, I have a bit of a challenge to give you an exact date or a quarter because it's very much depending on the COVID-19 pandemic situation we have at hand. But there will be news flow there, of course, going forward.
Okay. So really interesting times ahead, basically.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for coming to Pareto and presenting Pled. And if you want to follow the stock, it is traded under the ticker PLED on Stockholm Stock Exchange. And we also, as a company, have research coverage of PledPharma. And to get access to that, either contact your broker or go into www.paretosec.se. Thank you very much, Nicklas Westerholm.
Thank you, Pavas.